All right, it's Matthew Matt with my last little mini lecture for the semester. I just want to talk about some of the big ideas I see in our course. And if you want to do your concept map before this and get your own thoughts out, that's great. Or if you want to watch this first and that helps you think about your concept map, that works too. So I want to talk about a few big ideas. So one is we have this idea in our society that schools are the great equalizer, that schools cause society to be more just, more fair, because kids have opportunities through school to learn or get ahead, and that way anyone can succeed. And I really, although it wasn't the main theme of our course, I think a lot of the themes in our course really help us question this idea of whether schools are actually challenging injustice and working towards a more just society, or whether they're actually contributing to that injustice. So we're going to talk through that a little bit, and then we're going to talk through some possible solutions to some of these injustices that we've looked at this class. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I see as some of the overarching strategies from our class. All right, so what are some sources of injustice in our educational system? So one is the medical model of disability. This model of disability essentially says the problem is with the student. You know, they have some form of disability and that needs to be corrected or fixed or adjusted in some way that they can fit into the classroom. And this is a form of injustice because it bars them from accessing the content. Another form of injustice is the idea that because of the way we teach math, not everyone has access to it. There's only a couple, there's like one or two strategies, kids have to memorize it, and some kids are gonna kind of get it, and other kids are not going to get it. And we sort of treat that as normal, like we say, yeah, there's some math people and they're gonna do well, and other people aren't math people, and that's just the way it is. And that's a form of injustice because again, not everyone gets access to the mathematics. We've talked about formal tracking. So by formal tracking, I mean where there are explicit, like say different classes, and you can be in the high track or the college prep track, and you can be in the normal track or the low track and things like that. And so that's really formal tracking, but there's also informal tracking. And I've said here, this is like differentiated instruction gone wrong. If your approach to differentiated instruction is that you're essentially giving students different curricula, so that some kids are getting a very different exposure to mathematics than other kids or whatever discipline you're working in, then that's effectively a form of tracking in the classroom. And so again, people have different access to different forms of mathematics and different learning opportunities. And we've also talked about how both kinds of tracking disproportionately affect poor students and students of color, especially African American students and Latinx students. So what are some things we've looked at in our class that maybe could challenge some of these? For the first one, the most obvious is the social model of disability. This says, yes, the student has a disability, we're not denying that, but the problem is fundamentally with the environment. It's an interaction between the student and the environment, and we could change the environment to make the world more accessible to them. If every single building in the world and every house and home and everything like that had a ramp, then being in a wheelchair would not really be a disability. It would just be a different way of getting around. Similarly, the way we set up our math classroom can either be open to a broad range of students or it could be only open to a limited number of students. So the biggest idea that I see going along with this is universal design for learning. It really says, let me look at my teaching and think about how can I make this as open to all my students in general, but especially keep in mind my students who have disabilities and how I need to open up my teaching to make it more accessible to them. So this is good for everyone, but it is essential for students with disabilities. And it helps address the idea about where the problem comes from, whether it's with the student or the environment, and it helps open up access to mathematics so that more people can get it and get into it. Another big idea we had throughout the semester is sort of child-centered, strengths-focused, problem-solving based mathematics. So when math is, which many of you experience in school, when math is the teacher lecturing, showing a strategy, asking people to memorize how to do it, that's just not a great way for most people to learn mathematics. Only a few people will learn math in that way, and there's a reason a lot of people don't like math in our society. It just turns out it's not an effective method. When instead we say, what do my kids know? How can I find out their strengths and then start with that and start with math problems that challenge them where they're at and then push them further, then kids do a lot better. They learn more, they're more engaged, they think of math as something they can do and that they want to do. Finally, detracking is a direct way to counter formal tracking. You may or may not have control over this as a teacher, but you can certainly advocate for it. Talk to administrators, talk to colleagues, and say, you know, we might want to think about how we're tracking students. And then more directly in the classroom is the issue of effective group work. So we've talked about a lot of strategies, and I'll say a couple more on the next slide about how to make groups really work well together. And this can help everyone gain access to the mathematics, and it can also make sure that informal tracking isn't happening, because I make a rich problem that everyone can access and contribute to, and then I take strategies or structures as a teacher to make sure everyone's engaging with it and having access to that content. Something that's a little bit beyond the scope of our class related to things like tracking is that tracking is not just a school level or a classroom level issue. It's really a societal level issue also. Because of the way schools are funded in our society, which is based on taxes, on, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the word, on property taxes, schools get very different levels of funding, and therefore kids from different places in our society have access to very different educational opportunities. And that's something also as a teacher you should be informed about and able to advocate about, but it's not something you can change, say, in your own classroom. All right, so the other thing I want to talk about were a few big strategies that I hope you can take away from this class and think about as a teacher. The first is getting to know your students, and especially getting to know their strengths, and getting to know them both as individuals, because they are individual people, but also as cultural beings. One of the main failures in our educational system is that schools are a very white, middle upper class institution, and they have certain norms and rules for how to engage with them. And when those schools come into contact with people who have different ways of interacting, different ways of talking, different ways of accessing resources, then the school is often not very good at responding to them. And this is not necessarily because someone is intentionally racist or biased, but because of our unconscious biases or ways of thinking about things. So learning about a kid and their family and their community and what's important to them and how they interact in the world is an important part of identifying strengths and thinking about how to be responsive as a teacher. Related to this is you really want to focus on what your students know and how to build from that. And here I'm thinking especially about mathematically. It is just not super productive to start by thinking about what my kids don't know. It's much more valuable to think about, okay, what can my kids do mathematically and how do I start there and build on it? One of the best ways to do that is to ask questions before jumping in. So a kid is working on a project problem or they're stuck on something, instead of saying, okay, well, here's how we do it, ask questions to figure out their thinking, and it will tell you so much about them, about what they know, and about their strengths so that you can think about how to move forward. I don't know if I emphasized this as much as I had wished over this semester, but I really want to highlight that it's okay to pause, go back to the drawing board, and think about what new problem we should work on tomorrow or the next day or next week. It's okay if your kids walk away confused sometimes. In fact, I guarantee that many of your kids are walking away confused from many lessons. No lesson is going to teach everybody everything they need to know about a topic. So it's all right to pause and say, all right, this didn't go the way I thought. I really need to think about, now that I know a little bit more about my kids' thinking, I really need to think about what's a good next problem or a good next question to ask them. And that might not happen immediately. It might not happen on the spot. You might have to go home or you might have to talk to some colleagues and think about some ideas about how to do that. Learning does not take place in 40-minute chunks. It takes place over a period of time, and you really want to be thinking about that over time. Another big idea was about how to work well in groups. Group work is really most effective when all the kids have access. So we looked at ways you could share materials or take turns interacting or things like that in the class so that everyone has access to the content, and when everyone's held accountable. So we did like group quizzes, for instance, where I'd come around and roll a die and everyone had to be ready to answer. Or I use good questioning to make connections between kids' ideas. Or you might use things like follow-up assignments where kids still have to demonstrate that they also learned what happened in the group. You really want to foster an idea that we are responsible for each other's learning. Then the biggest other idea I would highlight is that you're never done learning as a teacher. You can continue to learn from your students. Asking questions and understanding their math thinking is one of the most powerful ways you can continue to learn new math. You can learn from your professional organizations. In math, the main one is the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics. And you can learn from experienced colleagues who can say, oh yeah, here's how a kid might think about that, or here's another strategy a kid might use on a problem like this. And so this idea that you really are going to keep learning, and I felt this came up most often with the standards. We read the standards so that you would have a big picture view of the math that you're expected to teach, but I do not expect you to be an expert in every standard at every grade level. That's just not realistic. What you need to be able to do though is look at those and think, what resources can I draw on to try to learn this? What can I look for to try to learn more about this before we have to teach it and unpack it? All right, I just want to end by saying thank you. I had a great semester. I hope that you did too. Please stay in touch. I like hearing from students, say when they're out in the field and they are, either they're a teacher or they're doing their student teaching or something like that, and they are stuck on a math lesson. And if you want advice on that, I'm happy to talk through it. And best of luck to all of you as you move forward into your teaching careers. Thanks a lot.